it's great to be part of this program. I feel like a little bit of a turncoat or a bait and switch. I imagine I was invited in part because I regularly use neuroscience in my own research, but I'm increasingly skeptical of the role of neuroscience in developing philosophical theories of behavior. So some of that skepticism will come out. I'm not a brain basher, but I think, as I'm sure we all do, that pluralism about methods is important. Okay, so my thought here is I would do a kind of taxonomy, beginning with places where I think neuroscience really can help and may even be our best tool in some cases. And the first kind of good case are cases of adjudication. So sometimes you get to a stalemate point between two theories, and the behavioral data don't settle which theory is right, so you need to look at some other form of observation. To give a classic example of this, so in the mental imagery debate, which occupied cognitive science, psychology, philosophy throughout the 1970s and 80s, two theories emerged. One that said visual imagery is kind of like mental pictures, and another that said visual imagery is more like language. The behavioral evidence not only didn't settle the debate, but actually in principle arguments came out that the very same behavior would be predicted by both models. So with the advance of cognitive neuroscience, theorists in this debate started to say, well, our theories make different physiological predictions. So one prediction is that the image-based model said that there's actually going to be an overlap in activity between the visual system and visual imagery. And the more language-like models didn't seem to make that prediction. And of course, lots of work in the ensuing years came out and tried to argue that fMRI evidence favors an overlap between visual imagery and vision. It doesn't settle the debate, of course. Interpreting these data require quite a lot of work, and the overlap is incomplete. So the data raise more questions than they answer, but they certainly show that one of the predictions that divides the two models comes out. Another area that's been sort of central to philosophy for some hundreds of years and central to my own work is a debate about the nature of the medium of thought. Do we think in more sensory kinds of representations, or is thought more abstract and amodal? And this has been a very animated debate in the cognitive neurosciences. Again, the behavior and for that matter, introspection don't really settle the debate. So two people might be given the same task and introspect and give different reports about how they're solving the task. So to try and figure out whether people are recruiting perceptual information in performing cognitive tasks requires some way of looking. And of course, there are some clever behavioral ways to do it, but cognitive neuroscience has again been quite helpful. So the image above is from Chow and Martin's study from about 2000, where they found that you see similar activation for both saying words to yourself silently and looking at pictures of the corresponding objects, and those activations are in sensory motor areas of cortex. The slide below, on the left, is from Pilvermuller, who's done lots of work trying to show that you can make predictions based on the sensory load of words to see activation in sensory systems during lexical processing. A similar thing in Barcelow and Simmons' work, saying if you code words for their sensory associates, you give people a lexical decision task, throw them under the magnet, and you'll see patterns of activation in sensory-specific cortices that correspond to the predictions. Another debate where neuroscience has been helpful in adjudication is in the debate about modularity. In an astonishing gesture at the beginning of an all too influential recent critique of modularity by Brian Scholl and Chaz Firestone, the authors say that they are not going to discuss neuroscientific data for the possibility of top-down effects in perception. But that choice to simply ignore this line of research is to ignore exactly the kind of data that makes their hypothesis a non-starter. It's well known, it's uncontroversial, it's perfectly well established that information can flow in both directions in cortex, and there's lots of work looking at that. You can do it with connectional anatomy, you can do it with behavior. The slide on the bottom by Lee gives macaques in a unit analysis study the same visual stimuli but two different tasks, and you can look at V1 activity as a function of task and show a differential. I think neuroscience also plays a role in discovery, so it can be used as a kind of discovery heuristic. Throw somebody in the scanner and just see what happens in an exploratory way. And sometimes there are surprising things. Of course, very few people would do that. That wouldn't be a very good use of funding. Usually you're looking for something else or trying out different things, or you have some preliminary data that leads you in a certain direction. But sometimes the proof is in the pudding, and you're doing the neuroscientific work, and you find things that end up guiding further research. To take another case with animal models, Kent Berridge's very influential work on the so-called liking and wanting distinction is, I think, a gorgeous example of how you can do conceptual analysis through neurosurgery. That is, you do an ablation study of a rat, and you show that two things that were thought to be indistinguishable, liking something and wanting it, they sort of, one always comes with the other, actually can be dissociated. And to generate dissociations in the lab opens up a conceptual space for the possibility that a lot of human behavior might involve one and not the other. And this has played an important role, for example, in models of addiction. So I think that's a place where the neuroscience really led us into an insight into how concepts work and how the mind works. Another possible case of a discovery heuristic use, this is Josh Green had the idea of taking an old philosophical thought experiment from ethics and doing it with neuroimaging. So the philosophical thought experiment probes people's intuitions, or philosophers report their intuitions about these trolley cases. So the question in this particular scenario is, would it be okay to push somebody into a trolley's path to prevent it from killing 5 people? Most people say that that would be wrong. But when presented with a structurally similar choice of pulling a lever that diverts a trolley from 5 people onto an alternate track where it will kill only 1, people tend to say yes. And when Josh Green decided to do this in a scanner, the results were somewhat surprising. And on his interpretation of it, in that switching case, you see greater activation of structures associated with cognition. And in the pushing case, you see greater activation within areas that he codes as being centrally involved in emotion. So you might have looked at philosophical work on this distinction and come up with a very abstract moral principle, like killing is worse than letting die, to give one of many principles that have been proposed over the years. But to turn out that if it turns out that the difference between these two tasks is their emotional load, that leads to new theory construction, new explanation of what's going on here, new models, and potentially even new ethical theories. To give one more example here, Tanya Singer was looking at punishment behavior, and we might have thought in constructing theories that people generally like to punish wrongdoers and feel pretty good about it. But she found that there's a strong gender effect. So when she had people look at justified punishment in the scanner, she showed that the female participants in her study showed much more vicarious pain than the male participants, and the male participants showed greater activation in the nucleus accumbens in a classic reward center than the women did when viewing justified punishment. And this is also a good corrective. There's a tremendous amount of gender bias, of course, in theory construction, and since the male researcher's voice is usually unmarked case, men who speculate about our desire for blood revenge and how wonderful that feels may develop theories that misrepresent individual differences that come out to, I think, Tanya Singer's surprise in the data. A second thing neuroscience can do is can play a role in explaining things that cannot be explained in any other way. A lot of psychological things are explained by psychological mechanisms. But there are some psychological things that have to be explained by physical mechanisms. There's no further hidden, say, suppressed desire that can explain the behavior. It's actually something in the physical machine itself. So neuroscience can sort of solve a puzzle that's set up for us by behavior. This is particularly true in the visual domain. If you get things like, so if you stare at fixation for a few seconds there, you can all do this for fun. Then you should get a color after image. So you might have experienced that poodle for a moment as pink. So how is this going on? So it's not an implicit desire to see pink poodles. It's something about the neurons, and we know quite a bit about this. We know both from bold signals that there is activity in visual areas, but much more interesting, there's a lot of work in cellular neuroscience, and you can show that things like decay rates of neurons at various stages from retina on up play a role in the intensity and various qualities of the after vector images. You can even show that the decay rates are affected by things like dopamine and generate predictions. And so you have beautiful models of exactly how some of these things work. Similar things to, this is Roger Tutel's classic paper on motion after effects, where he shows that not only is there activity in motion cortex, but its time course corresponds to the duration of the illusion, and models having to do with the decay rates of the neurons, again, is at work. Though controversial, there's evidence that the phenomenon of synesthesia can also be explained at the level of the underlying mechanism. So in this clever study by Anna Dovern and colleagues, they found greater connectivity between V4, classic color area, and other areas of the visual system for color grapheme synesthetes than in a comparison population. So mechanism is doing some explanatory work. Another area where neuroscience matters is sometimes actually we're interested in questions about the brain. If you're studying the mind, there are points where you might be interested in questions about the brain. One domain that's captured the interest of many philosophers is so-called mechanistic explanation. So people like Lindley Darden and Carl Craver, who are philosophers of science who want to know how we come to the point of understanding something in an explanatory way, have suggested that for certain domains of inquiry, there's a kind of decomposition into nested mechanisms. You divide the task into some set of functional subroutines, and then you find the mechanisms that play those roles, and this kind of keeps on going down. And in those cases, the mechanism, the underlying physical mechanisms in the brain might be relevant to your task. Another topic that's really raised neuroscience as an end of inquiry is research on consciousness. It's been seen as a kind of holy grail, just as there was an interest in finding the biological roots of life in the search for DNA that led to the double helix structure. There's a question of the physical basis of consciousness. And if you can identify one, that might play a role in undergirding a physical or materialist theory of the mind. So one way to do this is to begin with behavior, like, for example, Irvin Rock and Arjen Mack's work on inattentional blindness show that when given two concurrent tasks, one task might make the other, like an unexpected presentation of a triangle, invisible. And that leads to a certain behavioral conclusion that a phenomenon, consciousness, comes and goes with the allocation of attention. And then you can do things like fMRI and say, let's look at the difference between two conditions, a conscious condition and unconscious condition. And you get study after study using very different methods, showing that when consciousness is there, you get this kind of signature circuit involving, this is visual consciousness, so you get visual areas, you get interparietal sulcus, which allocates attention, and you get lateral frontal areas associated with working memory. And you get that again and again and again across a wide range of studies. And you say, what's going on there? And the answer may be, once you start to measure activity in individual neurons by torturing monkeys, is that certain kind of coordinated activity, like high-frequency synchronized oscillations, play a role in changing the flow of information so that visual information, when modulated by attention control structures, is able to access memory. So suddenly we have a mechanism underlying consciousness, and that was the goal of that particular kind of research. So these are all areas where you might say doing neuroscience is essential. If you're interested in neural correlates of consciousness, then trivially you need to look at neuroscience. So maybe that's uninteresting, but it does turn out that some theory construction and philosophy does ask questions about the brain. The brain is needed. That said, I do think there are lots of pitfalls of neuroscience as a source of information and theory construction. There is a lot of gratuitous imaging. I'm teaching a seminar this semester on political psychology, and I often in my seminars include some cognitive neuroscience, and I decided in this domain there's absolutely nothing worth including. And I might be wrong about this and would welcome a correction. I gave it a particularly egregious example. Drew Weston, who wrote a book about the political brain, did this study where he put Democrats and Republicans in the scanner, and he read them quotes with their favorite politician being hypocritical, and he found, sure enough, you get activity in the anterior cingulate, a classic conflict center, when you hear your own guy saying something hypocritical. So this is an example of really uninformative cognitive neuroscience, But I started thinking, what are the topics on my syllabus? Like we have a section on propaganda. We talk about partisanship. We talk about various sources of political influence. We talk about whether people are capable of deliberation and the way deliberative democracy demands. We talk about self-undermining policy endorsements. So all kinds of classic questions in political psychology. It's not clear that cognitive neuroscience is particularly likely to be illuminating for any of those questions. My own take here for what it matters is that to understand political behavior, we have a lot more to learn from social history, from political history, cultural history, than we do from any scanner study. So people interested in the study of the mind here can study the origins of ideas, where they come from, and make some progress that way. Why does the political landscape divide the way it does? Why is partisanship longer lasting in some countries than in others? Why do we get the particular platform breakdowns we get, and so on? Those are things that can be illuminated historically. Another pitfall is that neuroscience is often, I think, just the wrong place to look. I hate to pick on neuroaesthetics, but it is an embarrassment how bad neuroaesthetics is. Despite my deep passion for the brain and my deep passion for art, I find it very, very hard to find studies within cognitive neuroscience that have been particularly illuminating on this topic. So here's an early case. Ishizu and Zeki have a study showing people pretty pictures, and they give preference ratings for that. And sure enough, you see emotion and reward centers active when they like a picture. Occasionally, there are surprises here. I think Gabby Starr and Ed Vessel found some interesting step function responses in some of these reward structures in ways that turned out to be illuminating. But if you know the Gabby, the Starr and Vessel work, if you read the behavioral findings in that particular paper, they're vastly more illuminating than anything they get out of blood oxygen. So my own take here is that we need to move beyond the brain. Obviously, with neuroaesthetics, art history, socialization matters. We're doing studies right now in Japan where we look at whether exposure to different aesthetic traditions there affects aesthetic preferences in ways that differ from ours. We are including physiological measures. So for instance, there's a lot of Japanese art that uses empty space. And so we're using eye trackers because there is a question, do people in Japan treat the empty space as part of the image, or do they ignore it like we do here? And that's pretty much what we're finding. This is work with my collaborator, Jörg Fingerhut, and now Hideaki Kawabata in Tokyo. And this is a physiological measure, but we learn more from eye tracking, this very lo-fi measure, simple measure, than we would from a scan. Other work with Angelika Seidel is looking at viewing position and evaluations of art, so it's a kind of embodied psychology study. I think we learn more about that and manipulating things that affect judgments of beauty through physiology than through work on the scanner. Another issue, and I'm winding down, is there are often misleading labels. I mentioned before very innocently Josh Green's emotion centers and cognitive centers. But if you look at the things he calls emotion centers and cognitive centers, they are quite weird. In fact, none of the classic emotion centers emerge in his first study. And when he talks about cognitive centers, he helps himself to something that most researchers in cognitive neuroscience do too. They say DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's a cognition center. But of course, it doesn't take more than 5 minutes of database searching to find out that it comes up frequently in studies of emotional memory, that it's frequently active in studies of positive emotions. And of course, the presence of DLPFC, which is involved in working memory, might suggest that it's not cognition, but emotion regulation. It's playing a role in assessing and reflecting on our emotions or keeping our emotions in mind rather than pure cognition. My own take on this is the emotion-cognition dichotomy is a bad one. It's continued to exert, I think, a very damaging influence in cognitive neuroscience, and we should be cautious about that. Very little needs to be said about mirror neurons, but mirror neurons will I think, emerge in the history of science as one of the most farcical cases of overreaching in modern behavioral science. So the dear members of the Parma group I love will write papers like about how mirror neurons explain empathy and human sociality and even language and everything else that's good and distinctive about us. But the animals in which they've been found aren't particularly social and don't speak language, and presence of these things in social cognition tasks has been very difficult to find. In fact, it wasn't found in such tasks. All these things are a giant and unsupported stretch. My own take is the whole idea of looking for sociality cells is a complete waste of time because sociality is a sufficiently complex phenomenon that that level of reductionism is bound to mislead. A final, penultimate thing, I think a lot of work in the interpretation of neuroscientific results is extremely theory dependent. I mentioned those studies by people like Barcelow and Chow and Martin and Pilgrim-Müller before, showing wonderful evidence for sensory specificity of encoding of information. For every Barcelow of the world, there are opponents who reject those views. So interpretation of these data often reveal the biases of the researchers, and my own biases in interpreting these data are rife. So when I look at how I've used neuroscience in the past with this constant cherry picking, I feel a need to blush. So my own take here is that there's no evidence that we can sort of do the ultimate experiment that settles debates in neuroscience, and now we have the decisive bit of information. The data are only the beginning and require a return back to theory for interpretation. Final thing, I think there's been a terrible overinvestment in neuroscience with respect to the understanding of the mind. This is one of my favorite pastimes. I troll through the NIH and NIMH website to see what they're funding. And I just pick topics like alcoholism. For you today, I picked depression because it's something close to home. So this is NIH funding for depression in New York City. So to keep my search, this was hand-coded, so to keep my search short, I looked at New York City from 2017 to the present, meaning to yesterday when I did this. The number of projects in New York on depression that have been funded by the NIH, 171. The number of those that deal explicitly and exclusively with depression of the brain, 153. The number of investigations that look into sociogenic factors that modulate incidence of depression, 4 of 171. That's 1.5% of the studies being studied on depression are studying the sociogenic causes. I also looked at suicide. From the same period, the number of projects on suicide, 41, the number of brain terms in the title of these 41, 23, so over 50% of the studies on suicidal behavior are explicitly about the brain, many more when you look at the descriptions. The number investigating environmental causes, 6 of the 41, and of those, 3 of them focus on the brain. So this is just terrible because if you look at effect size as what drives people to depression, what makes people depressed, what leads to suicide, look cross-nationally. And you have countries where there's virtually no suicide, countries where there are high incidence. You look across genders, you look across race, you see huge differences here. White people kill themselves much more often than people of color. Depression is much more frequent in women than it is in men. So these factors are just being ignored. And of course, culture is mentioned in one of these studies, but it's cell culture. My own take here is just that culture, that social identity matters. So in conclusion, I do think there are lots of places where cognineuro is needed. It can serve to adjudicate between theories. It can serve as a discovery heuristic. There are cases where psychological explanations give out, and there are cases where we're really interested in underlying mechanisms. But elsewhere, I think it can be overly simplistic. I think it's often gratuitous. I think, like everything, it's theory-laden, and I think a lot of the expenditure is wasteful. I will say that my own favorite social science, psychology, is guilty of much of this as well. I would venture that we can learn more about the mind from a third-tier psych journal. Subscribe to a third-tier psych journal for 1 year, and then subscribe to all the cogneuro journals for the same year. And I think we learn more about psychology from that psych journal, which maybe is unsurprising. So I have greater faith in psychology than cognitive neuroscience with respect to understanding how the mind works. But I think I was trained to be a cognitive scientist. I think cognitive science was a giant mistake. It gave us this list of fields we could listen to. So we stopped reading history, we stopped reading sociology. We've only recently come back to anthropology. We thought for years that artificial intelligence mattered. I think we need to stop doing that. These lists of what fields matter are destructive. We should ask questions, and we should let the questions decide where we look. And it may turn out that just as I thought psych has more to teach us about the mind than neuroscience, I now think history has more to teach us about the mind than psychology. So we need a more expansive, pluralistic approach. Thank you.